All right. Well, hello. I am Josh, and welcome to Be Human. Here today with my friend Sarge. She is the fearless camp leader of Scrambles, who I met at Burning Man. Yeah. So welcome, Sarge. Obviously, the place I met you in is a place full of, I think, unique examples of what it means to be human. So I guess we'll just keep it vague and start with, I guess, what does it mean to you exactly to be human? Feel free to answer that as long or short as you wish.
Yeah, no, that's a big one, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. I think it's interesting being human because I'm pretty convinced that we're a hive mind species.
Right.
And there's this funny intergenerational culture part of humanity, right? Like, I like to think of humanity as like a coral, you know, where it's the outer layer that's alive and moving and doing things, but also where that outer layer is the result of all of these generations of little polyps, you know. So the coral builds over time on this structure of whatever's alive at the moment, but then it dies, and it leaves behind this legacy, and I think that humanity is kind of like that. Like we are who is alive right now. We are the outer layer of the coral, but also I think that our consciousnesses don't make sense out of the context of culture and language and teaching and thought. So we are deeply social species. We are deeply interrelated. If a human being does not get verbal stimulus when they're like 2 years old. Our brains develop differently, and what little we know about what that looks like, which is from terrible cases of extreme abuse, is that our brains do not form properly, that those people are forever marred. So our biology is meant to be social. It is meant to be held by community. And I think that's a really interesting relationship between us who are alive right now and everything that has come before us. And then, of course, our legacy and what we leave behind after us, and how we set up subsequent humans.
What a beautiful answer. I really like that. So I don't actually know too much, I guess, about the biology of coral, but I'm taking from what you just explained that like coral reefs and such in the ocean is essentially developed from the life that came before it that then I guess it mineralized, if that's the right word, and
Yeah, yeah.
calcified. Right, right. And okay, very interesting. That's a beautiful then like analogy of it. I really like that a lot. I never really thought about it that way, and then even more so too, I guess, with, like, coral reefs, because I know, like, on the outside, you just see their harder shell, but then underneath and within is still all this life that's swimming in and out of it, but then you still have the I guess, the calcification remains to kind of tell the tale of the lives in the past.
Yeah, my understanding of coral, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, is that so a coral is actually a collection of or organisms rather, so it's all of these little polyps, uh, similar to all of us individual humans. And yeah, once again, that outer layer is where the life is. But where that is in space and time really is determined by all of the polyps that came before. And so it
Definitely.
builds over time. And if you see a big coral structure, that's the result of many, many generations.
That's really beautiful, and then something I was, kind of noticing when I was in Miami back in December looking on the beach was just how much the sand is comprised of all the fragments and shells, like, I guess as a kid, I thought sand was just, I don't know, it was some sort of fine dirt or dust or whatever, but then you realize, oh, it's sand is literally just comprised of um, all the dead life, right? Whatever came from the past. I guess it's
Yeah.
similar with same with just the dirt in the ground and everything, ash to ashes, dust to dust, or something like that.
It's all matter being reconstituted all the time.
Right, right, right. So that honestly is very much the way you described it has very much been how I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be human lately. I actually last week I asked ChatGPT to customize a some sort of a thought experiment for me that would challenge my own beliefs and help me kind of like become aware of some blind spots that I might be having in my own life. And it proposed to me this kind of question. It said basically, I'm just going to summarize, but it said you have two life paths. So imagine you're 40, and so all the decisions you make in the next 10 years, you split into two directions,
I
and
am
essentially,
40.
so it's where I will be soon. So option A essentially is because I talk a lot about how do I break free from the system? How do I get escape velocity? How do I have freedom? And I talk a lot about things like this. And it said, so option A, you achieve total freedom. You're making a lot of money. You're doing great, but you never really integrate in communities. You never quite develop those great grounded relationships. You're free to go wherever you want in the world. You don't worry about money. You don't worry about any of these things. But then there's this part of you that kind of never quite felt connected. And then option B was you don't achieve full freedom. You end up within the structure. You're coaching kids football or you're attending community programs and you have great developed relationships, but you might not have all the money in the world and you might be to these limitations. And like I never quite thought about it that way. And for a long time, I've been caught up in this idea of I want to be free. I want to escape the system. This is corrupt. And,
Yeah,
especially on
what do you
social
mean by
media,
full freedom?
I think that's what I'm trying to figure out. So one of my questions right now is what does it truly mean to be free? There was another quote I was kind of thinking on recently, and I can't remember the exact quote, but premise was like, oftentimes to be free is to select the chains because to be free from or to be, I think like the fantasy version of free means you can do whatever you want all the time, but then that really means you're just a slave to all your desires versus freedom within a structure, I guess within discipline means you aren't truly free because you still have to adhere to certain principles or structures or systems. But within those systems, you find a different sort of freedom and peace and happiness. So I guess trying to figure out exactly how to phrase this question. There was this other. I'm just keep throw something else out there. There was this other video I watched recently where someone was talking about civilization, how civilization is a system that essentially strips humanity away, and maybe that's a negative way to phrase it, but part of us being humans, like a civilization requires structure and it rewards consistency, rewards productivity, rewards all these things. But what humans we crave is connection. We crave unpredictability. We crave spontaneity. We crave love. We crave taking risks, doing all these things that are not logical necessarily. So yeah, I mean, back to the question, I guess, what does it mean to be human? How do you find, I guess, the balance sometimes within that, within operating within a structure, a system, which is humanity, which is in this world which without it, you don't have this coral reef that is built to reflect everything that came before.
Yeah. And so I'm, just kind of throwing out a few concepts here. So one, freedom, I think is a complicated topic. And what does it mean to be free? So when I think of freedom, I think the right to self-determination, right? I get to choose where I put my labor. I get to choose what I do with my time. So right to self-determination, I think that for me, freedom is the right to a certain sort of authenticity, right? As long as I'm not hurting anyone else, then I should get to do what I want, because
Mm,
this is America, But also, I think that like freedom so most humans have not been free by our standard. Currently are not. Most humans live under governments where maybe they do not have the right to full self-expression or to criticize that government. I think freedom is how we think of it in our day and age, and I think how you're conceptualizing it too, which is a certain sort of financial security, right? And that's true. Like if you have to focus all of your efforts and energies on basic acts of staying alive, on like collecting enough food, or, are you able to like explore self-expression, but it's interesting, because like we do have these strictures of society, but without society, we would be really fending for ourselves, and so there's this interplay between community and society and prosperity. and scarcity.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
all comes together. But I
Yeah.
think for humans to thrive, I keep going back to just these four pillars of health. So to thrive, most people and how we kind of think about things in health literature, you need to eat well, you need to sleep well, you need to exercise, and you need to be social. So socialness and community is the fourth pillar of health. It really is. And so, we make trade offs within that, because sometimes I don't have enough time in my day to hit all of those equally well. But yeah, it's a little bit rambling, but I guess there is something interesting at this nexus of what individual freedom looks like, what communal freedom looks like, how we pursue our own freedom, and then how we guarantee the freedom of others. So I hope that the story of humanity is one in which an increasing number of people are free, and that very freedom increases our productivity as a species. That when people are free and they are dedicating their efforts to things that they find interesting and that they want to do, that actually we can like unlock you know we could unlock a lot of things. We could unlock more knowledge, we could unlock more productivity, we could unlock more art and culture. All of these
Mm.
things matter. People are creative when they're free, and when they're not free, when they're stifled, what they produce is like less good.
Would you say then that a big issue that we're dealing with a lot in society right now is lack of freedom in that case? Because I feel like we see a lot of people struggling with a lot of those things you just mentioned with the ability to be creative, the ability to be expressive, the ability to be self-identifying. So would you say like a lot of those issues are stemming from a lack of freedom?
I think it's complicated. And so, I think that we certainly have ground to make on freedom. I
Mhm.
think that we could certainly be freer. I think that we could have more rights protected. But then there's this interesting human thing where, like, our identities are so determined by each other.
Mhm.
And like when humans feel insecure and scared, they tend to act poorly. When humans feel accepted and welcomed and loved, they tend to act well. And like,
Right.
and I think you need the communal constructs to feel secure and accepted and loved. And so it's not clear to me that individual humans could actually be free because we're a social species and would require that context.
Mhm. That's a good point. I like that a lot. What I guess, I think you probably already said it, but how would you define freedom?
Yeah, so, self-determination, the right to be expressive. I think that there's also like the right to, I think it's interesting. I think some part of freedom must be the right to be welcomed in your community, right? And so when I think about the freedom, for example, of like a gender nonconforming person to break these like gender rules formed by society, but then also not just to have protections for housing and jobs, though those are important and we should protect that, but also to be accepted,
Mhm.
that like freedom, that there's some communal aspect of it that I haven't quite totally figured out. But like, it's interesting when you enter a room of people that think you're an outsider, how that feels, as opposed to entering a room of people that think you are one of them. And maybe in both cases, you've never met any of the people, but like,
It's like the energy is very discernible in either one, for sure.
yeah, yeah. And so I think that there's like ultimate goal for humanity would be that we can identify with each other a little bit better and work
Mhm.
together a little bit better, and that we can see ourselves in other humans, even if they look different, have different cultures, But I think, yeah, I think that there's some communal aspect of it. And I think one of the reasons why maybe we're having a little bit of an erosion of certain kinds of freedoms is that we didn't have like communal togetherness, that collective identity to keep that open and welcoming kind of social construct.
Which I almost feel like, because I feel like there's, a large demographic that talks about the good old days and what that freedom represented to them. Same demographic is typically more or less inclusive of non-gender conforming individuals and such, right? And I almost wonder if a lot of that is a form of projection because that sense of freedom was only ever free as long as you followed some strict guidelines and you adhered to certain social standards that were decided by who knows at some point in time, right?
Yeah. And the first one was like based on your skin color and where you were born,
Mhm.
And so I think that it is a human, I think it is within human nature that we easily grant humanness to people that we relate to, that I can see someone who looks like me and be like, oh, I immediately accept that person as a full human.
Right,
And
right.
that we get challenged when people are really different from us, And one of the ways to overcome that is shared identity. And so, one of my kind of pet theories, of how we, kind of ended up in this moment that we find ourselves currently in is that it really is the case that we stopped the project of building shared identity as Americans. I think that the left and the academic left needs to think about that a little bit and what it means to be an American, what it means to be proud to be an American, and how we can reconcile that with the faults of America. But it turns out that having that shared identity mattered. And
Hmm.
as that shared identity has eroded, we now see that people think that maybe we're a little too different, that maybe they need to bring in the boundary of who gets to really count.
So I guess this is almost again, correct me if I'm misunderstanding what you said, but what I'm taking from that is that maybe similar to be free from everything is a slave to everything. I'm just like generalized quote, I guess, that I'll make up. In the same way to be free of all identity means you're a slave to all identities versus like having a common shared goal, whether or not it's perfectly aligned with because each individual is going to have its own variations. But as long as there's a common theme that everybody more or less follows, then it's more cohesive and more, I guess, more community driven as opposed to, I don't know. It almost seems to me in some ways too that freedom is, and this is not at all to try to minimize people's experience, especially in America right now and any other parts in the world, but freedom seems that many times to be a mentality as much as it is a physical actuality that oftentimes we are just as much not free because of our own minds as we are because of our external surroundings.
No, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that, the degree to which you take ownership over the choices, even if the choice set is constrained by forces bigger than yourself, like we make choices in our lives and no one else is going to do that for us. And like seeing the ownership of that and like making sure that we focus on what we can change, and move forward. But it's also easy to abdicate responsibility and to
Right,
say, like, well, what am I going to do? Nothing. And then you do nothing. And then that's what you
right,
get.
right. You kind of alluded to that there was a overall like what it meant to be an American, I guess. What it meant to be free as an American, and there was a common set of values, I suppose, that people held together, and that's what created strength that we have slowly deteriorated away from that, correct?
Yeah. And for a lot of different reasons, and I get why. So one of the issues is that, and it's interesting, and I want to preface this by saying that, like, for any equilibrium you find yourself at, any equilibrium we find ourselves at together, there's forces on multiple sides that are, you know, equally pushing us, and that's how we ended up at this equilibrium.
Mhm.
And so for ideas, what that can often mean is that multiple things are true.
Mhm. Yes, yes, yes.
Multiple things are true, and we need to hold complexity. And so it is true that power has a tendency to entrench, and that power structures write narratives, and that like a powerful nation like the US, that we can use that power to hide our flaws. That is true. And it is important to shine a light, and it is important to think about who has power and who doesn't, and how that power entrenches. Because I think it's the entrenching that's actually the issue, you know. But it's also true that
When
the
you say
US,
entrenching, you essentially mean, like, following such a deep pattern that it becomes hard to follow the nuance?
it becomes self-protecting. That
Mhm.
powerful people want to protect themselves. They want to keep the
Right,
power.
right.
Institutions that have power want to keep the power,
Which then prevents outside influence that may benefit things or steer things in a better direction from coming in. Right.
Yeah. What it does is it actually cuts off competition,
Mhm,
and we want things to stay competitive, but, it's true that power tries to protect itself, I think it's human nature. You get a little bit of power, the first thing you think is, how can I keep this?
mhm.
And that's not the greatest impulse that we have in our hearts, but it's also true in the US that actually, since its inception as a country, the US has been a force for human freedom. Both of these things are true. And the degree to which I respect our institutions is actually the degree to which I think it is furthering human freedom. And my identity as an American, experiment where, in fact, you could be American without having been born in the country. You can be American. Your children can certainly, they're definitely American. That like inclusion in the national project is not based on your blood. It's not based on your heritage. It is based on you being here, you know? And it's a powerful concept because that's not true in many older countries. We're a new world country, And so human freedom was expanded by the founding of the US. And despite the imperfect way in which we hold that standard, we have made ground over time, and we are
Mhm.
freer, and more people get to be free. And we should continue that. We should be proud of what we've done. We should acknowledge the errors, just like any person. I have things in my past I'm proud of. I have things in my past I've learned from.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We make mistakes. We're human. That's the whole thing. We're not perfect, and no group of humans is going to be even, more perfect. That's not how it works, or flawed. I wasn't raised with religion, but recently I've been thinking a lot about some of the tenets of Christianity. There's some really good ones. We
Mhm.
are imperfect. We iterate, we learn, and yeah, and accountability is the process through which we do that,
Right, right. I think with, like, religion, I was talking with a friend about that the other day. I did grow up very religious and, went through, for the first 18 years of my life was pretty heavy into religion, and then not by some grand breakup, but just due to life going a different direction, ended up kind of like stepping away. And then in the stepping away, I quickly just did a 180 and was like, I don't know how I feel about any of it. And so then went on my own kind of journey through that. And now recently kind of coming full circle back around and started to look back into some things again. And one thing I am sure of is that it's an excellent framework, like what, regardless of your specific beliefs, it's an excellent framework for how to be a good person and how to treat those around you and how to carry yourself in general. And that's something that like a lot of people lack without the benefit of religion. And I think also with anything, I think we as humans tend to want to find we want to find that perfect example that we can, or standard to use as a guiding light for us, and also, I guess, maybe to feel better about the imperfections of humanity, because at least there is a perfect standard. And so I think we look at religion like, oh, this is the perfect standard, like it has all the answers, when in reality, even religion itself, I think, is very imperfect. And that's where people, myself included, get frustrated, is because we, I think, hold it to too high of a standard, or at least the people that are involved in it. And then at some point in time you realize, nobody's really perfect. It's really just a framework. I think it's a guidelines to help kinda get you there, but it's not necessarily all of the answers. Some of the answers you gotta find yourself, I guess.
Yeah, and also, there are different wisdoms that we can take from different cultures across,
Mhm.
everyone has been thinking about what it is to be a human. Since humans, presumably started existing, we've been thinking about it, because like what does it mean that we're conscious? What does it mean to pass on information to our children? What does it mean to build culture over time? Which is how we work together. And so, like religion, like the Christian tradition, you have these incredibly powerful concepts of like grace. What an incredibly powerful concept. I love grace, holding grace for ourselves, for others, there's a lot there that's like very powerful, when you think about, some of the original like teachings of Christ, which were about seeing the humanness in other people. The message is love people. And when we love people, we can hold grace for them and we can work together. We can work through issues. And that's a really incredible framework. But there's also, when you think about some of the teachings of Buddhism, which are different, it's a different culture, but I think also has some profound insights on what it is to be a human, and I hope that like yeah, that I think that when we get too locked into a single channel, we miss information that exists in other channels, and that there's being a little bit humble and curious
Mm.
gets us a lot of places,
I think it's
you
back to what you
know.
said too about entrenching, and I think that was, I think with religion, that's a really good point to bring up, because where I stand now with my spiritual, religious, what have you, beliefs is very much a combination of a lot of Buddhism and a lot of Christianity. But now, when I just the way that I understand the scriptures and things like that, versus, as a kid, it was like, "Oh, this is the verse is exactly what it says, and it's very literal." Now when I look at these different teachings, and I'm not the most well-versed, some people may disagree with me here, but I think they're all saying the same thing. I don't really think they're all saying, they're using different, methods to achieve the same goal. And I think when you take them literally, that's when I think a lot of people start argue, "Oh, this religion is better than this one." But I don't think they're ever meant to be literal. It's a lot more esoteric most of the time, where it's like, it's not literally saying, you know, I can't think of a specific example. Like, it's not necessarily you've got to follow the 10 commandments to go to heaven, or whatever, but it's, if you naturally do those 10 commandments, it'll lead you to being the type of person that you need to be a good person, be a good human.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and one thing with religion is that like you do have the entrenched power aspect of it.
Mhm.
You know? And so like we saw this, for example, scandals around the Catholic Church protecting people who were abusing children. You know,
Right.
that like when power entrenches and protects itself, it generally becomes less good.
Right. Right.
You
Right.
know,
Starts to create that echo chamber.
and once again, an institution is only as good as the degree to which it can fulfill its mission and its promise, and so we should always be judging our institutions. Are they living up to the mission statement? And if they because there are people that benefit from it,
Mhm.
then maybe that's a less good institution.
Sure.
But actually, I'm a deep institutionalist and I believe in and trying to reform what's there. When I was younger, I was a more tear it down and rebuild kind of person. But as I get older, I think that there's a lot of wisdom that has accrued over time, and that it's folly on average to throw everything out. So I'm generally, for a lot of things, a little bit more of an incrementalist than, many people I know.
Kinda swinging on the pendulum right now. I definitely was very high on the burn it all down, message for a while, but, in recent years, I've started to and again, especially back to that thought experiment ChatGPT with ChatGPT, I've been thinking to myself, like, do I really want to just have complete freedom and be able to live outside the system? But then it's like, maybe it is actually more, you know I think to be human is all just about experience, and to win the game of capitalism is not necessarily experience. I mean, sure, that's an experience, but I think you get a lot more experience from participating.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's one of you know, the primary thrusts of Burning Man, right?
Mhm.
Is that it is a participation culture.
And Burning Man itself is kinda like a sandbox, I think. It's because I mean, like, you're talking about institutions and how it's important to or with religions to question and to not become too entrenched, and Burning Man, I think, is like an annual do we really know how to be humans? Let's throw it all away and start over and just see for a couple weeks or a month or whatever and see if we're still doing things the right way.
Yeah, so Burning Man is definitely a sandbox. It's definitely a container, you know. And I think that it's a container. It's I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot going on there. But I think one of the things that we play with out there is what does it mean to be in a post-scarcity society
Mhm.
where
Right,
we're not
right, right.
resource hoarding, where actually we've brought a lot to gift out and we are, and it's not in exchange for anything. It's the joy of the gift, you know, and like I think it's an experiment in post-scarcity, and that post-scarcity gives us like cultural openness, you
Mhm.
know. But then of course, there at the same time, one of the 10 principles is radical self-reliance because it's in the
Right,
desert and it's hard to live.
right, right.
And so, yes, everything there is a gift, but also, yes, you need to take care of yourself and be prepared.
Mhm.
And I think about that tension a lot, about that nexus between self-care and community care and how they interrelate, And so all humans need other humans sometimes. Sometimes I need someone to like hold this thing while I do something, you know. But like when humans work together, I can't build camp all by myself, but with 25 of my best friends, we can make a lot of progress.
Hell yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we can build a lot actually, and we do. Uh, and so, like, there's working together, and then there's also, the self-care. Like, I don't want people who are working on camp to burn themselves out. I think taking care of yourself and making sure that you are okay actually helps the rest of us, you know? Because the last thing any of us want is for someone to push too far and then, frankly, break and then make that the rest of our problems. I don't want that being my
Yes.
problem.
Yeah, it benefits
And
us
so,
all.
yeah, so self-care is community care, but at the same
I like
time,
that
you
self-care is
can't
community care,
do
definitely.
yeah, yeah, but we can't do everything ourselves, and so at some points, we have to ask for help, and, like, that's not just okay, that's the whole point of being a social species, because in those moments where we ask for help, we are able to do more than we could by ourselves. We accomplish
It's
more.
so true. Burning Man is one of those interesting containers for that. I mean, that's something I struggle with for sure is asking for help. And I know, I mean, my first year going, I've been 2 years now, my first year, and then even last year preparing, I had this mild panic. Like the first year I went, I survived the first 2 or 3 days on like 3 tuna packets and some chips or something because I was too afraid to ask for help because I was like, I messed up because I didn't prepare right. So I was just beating myself up about it and refused to even like ask for help. When then once I kind of got to know everybody, it was quick like, dude, there's so many people ready to help you. And then there's also the other factor of, because you think
And
I'm
we're
the kind of
all
guy, right?
better off if we help you, you
Right,
know? Like,
right,
we are all better off if we help you in our camp,
right.
a better fed Josh is, like, better for our community.
It's a stronger ladder for sure. But yeah, and I think the beauty too of one of my favorite things about Burning Man is the impermanence of it all. So it's stress testing so many parts of what it means to be human, which is why I think you're the funny thing also, like I last year, about a year and a half ago or so, I started listening to a lot of podcasts, and kind of around this time last year, I was like, okay, this is something I really enjoyed listening to. I also enjoy having these kind of conversations. Most people, I can't really spring them on people anywhere because I'm always in this deep thought mode. Most people aren't, and I'm not trying to like shock people at the bar or party all the time with some philosophical existential crisis.
I do it all the time, frankly.
Hey,
But
I'm
I'm
sure
not
I
in
do more
crisis,
than I
I
need
don't
to.
need anything
Right?
from them,
Sure,
I'm just
sure,
talking.
sure. Right? Exactly, exactly. But it was actually you last year. You messaged me something. You just messaged me one time and said, "Hey, I would love to talk to you about what it means to be human." And it was in that moment I was like, "That's what I want to do this podcast about. To be human. That's it." It was just that simple message, and it clicked in my mind. And me, I was like, "That's exactly what this I want this podcast to be about." Because um, I don't really know what it means to be human, and I want to figure it out. And I don't think there's an answer, but I also think that part of my role is to explore what the answer might be and try to get as
Yeah,
close to it as I can. So,
yeah. No, and being human's hard, It's hard simultaneously being an individual and then also the product of everything before you.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
That's a hard line to walk, It's a hard line to walk being an
It's like seeing all
individual.
this rigid coral below you and then thinking, "Well, like, what difference do I make? That's already set in stone. I can't do anything to change it."
And also how I think my thoughts are partially determined by that,
Mhm.
the ideas that we think are possible, that like we're building on if we're doing it right, we're building on what came before and pushing further out, and hopefully that's like how humanity keeps on going, you know. I want to
How do you
get into the
maintain
stars,
freedom? How would you say you maintain your freedom? Like, how do you exist? Okay, so first of all, I don't know a whole lot about you, but you're an economist, right? Within a very powerful structure. But within that, how do you and yet you're also one of the most free people I can think of. So where do you find your key to balancing that, to being, having heavy responsibility within rigid structures while also maintaining because I think this is definitely where freedom being a state of mind comes into play because for you it's not yeah, I mean what would you say?
Yeah. So, like, I learned over the course of years, and Burning Man was a big part of this, like who I am. And to be clear, who I am is also always changing. It is always changing. And so that's not a process that like stops, unfortunately. I wish it did. I'm so tired, you know? And so I think having a strong sense of identity, like this is who I am, this is what I stand for. But I didn't always have that. That's something that I developed. And part of that process for me as someone who's going to Burning Man, this will be my 15th year, like part of that process was finding my people who not just accepted who I was, but who celebrated it, you know? And, like, in that way that, like, community is part of us feeling secure enough to be ourselves, you know? And so I'm lucky that my life is very in alignment, and by that, I mean I spend my time doing things that I wanna do. My job, which I'm an economist, I have a PhD, and I am in the realm of national security and defense. That's something that very recently maybe chafes on me a little bit more, but I'm not throwing in the towel yet. But it's an interesting sphere and one that Once again, the US historically has been a force of global stability, and not always and not perfectly, right? But on average, we as a country have dedicated ourselves to a rules based world,
Hmm.
right? And that's good because without it, now you have a strength based world, which generally means more human suffering.
Hmm.
And so, yeah,
Which we're seeing a bit of a
one of my
transition there, I
trans
think.
partners, yeah, one of my partners jokes that I'm like the most patriotic person they know, which is funny. It's a
Well, I
funny
think you have a
thing.
lot of polarity on it in general, because I think I mean, generally, if I hear somebody that's involved with national security, my first thought is not burner that I could absolutely get down and have a good time with, you know? And
Yeah,
my thought is,
yeah.
"Oh, we probably won't get along. I'm probably not gon we're not gonna understand each other. We're not on the same page," which obviously is not the case with you. So, I think that is very interesting. It's definitely an interesting contrast.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast. And I, have very much enjoyed my job. Though, once again, if I don't feel like that is an institution that protects human freedom anymore,
Mhm.
then I will do something different with my effort,
Right.
and that's the bar at which I judge it, you know. And so I think that me seeming free, and I am, because I'm living the life I want to live. And
Mhm.
that is a lot of freedom. And like, yeah, it has been like a combination of like, frankly, I'm a woman born in America, and that has given me certain freedoms. America is where Burning Man is held, in the United States. And like that container of Burning Man, that couldn't exist everywhere,
Mm.
and like I think that, and I'm lucky enough to have been raised by parents that loved me and who were financially secure. And like I think if we do things right as humans, that every generation is freer than the one before, where we have expanded the scope a bit, but like my mother, when she was 20 years old, wasn't legally allowed to have a bank account, by herself. That didn't happen until she was like 21.
Right. Right.
you know and so like we've seen this march over time, and we should celebrate it and keep pushing, you know
I think that's a really important reminder, and I've heard you kinda echoed that a couple times that, again, multiple things can be true, but it's important to remember that America has been a place of freedom and empowering freedom, and I guess, I mean, it seems to me that relative to the rest of the world, America has been the leader in freedom since its inception, and despite a lot of the current, you know, conversation being around it not going the right direction, I think, again, both things can be true. We're having a lot of issues we're dealing with, trying to figure it out, but on the other hand, it is the container for a place like Burning Man, which where else in the world could that exist, you know?
it's such a Western thing. Burning Man is so deeply rooted in the American West.
Mhm.
And to be clear, the concepts of Burning Man can be applied anywhere in the world and are,
Right. Right.
but I don't think it's a coincidence that it was born in the American West,
Right. And I mean, while it is a Western thing, from my experiences in traveling and such, Burning Man is not just another country, it feels like another planet. Like, it is so far beyond any other social fabric that I've ever experienced. It's quite
Yeah.
a unique experience.
It is, and I think that I don't feel freer in my life than when I'm at Burning Man. That is, in fact, the max of my personal freedom, and especially when I was younger, before I figured out who I was even a little bit. That took like 30 years, even just the tiniest bit,
Sure, sure.
And I'm probably shortchanging my younger self, who definitely like had some things going on, figured some things out. And I'm sure when I look back in 30 years, if I'm not lucky to be able to do so, I will feel similarly about my current 40-year-old self, all the things I
Right.
didn't know,
The bar just keeps raising.
Yeah, because that's progress and learning.
Mhm.
But when I first went to Burning Man, it was the freest I ever felt to be myself, where like I felt like I could dress how I want, be big, be awkward on a dance floor, not care about the judgment of other people because part of it is that I have exactly as much right to exist and take space and to express as anyone else. But also Burning Man's a little bit more than that. It pushes beyond that. It's not just that I have the right. It's that it's cool if I do, and if a bunch of us do, we will see things that we haven't seen before. It's if we can harness the collective imagination of 70,000 people, then 70,000 people create all sorts of things I had never imagined before because I am
Mhm.
only one person. And so it's not just like cool, live and let live. It's that the community is stronger if you do, that we're all stronger and better off, and the world is more interesting if I can see your point of view, and see what special, unique human you are.
Right. I wonder, kind of random question, but I wonder how Burning Man would play out if it was not temporary, if it was built back in 95 or 6 or 97, somewhere in that era, and then it stayed there through today, how different the structure in that container would look as opposed to it being recreated from the ground up each year. Because I feel
Yeah.
like part of the beauty is it's part of the dance of life in general, that if you I mean, I think part of that freedom and that sense of creativity comes from returning to the default and then going back and then returning and then going back and it because I think you can't, I'm a firm believer in yin yang in pretty much every aspect of life that if you live in one side for too long, then it kind of loses its unique specialness, I guess, and entrenches, right? And ends up, so if you just stayed at Burning Man, I can imagine factions and politics and cliques and all these things would rise up so much strong. I mean, those things already exist to some level,
All
but they
right.
would exist so much stronger if it didn't break away, come back, because I think that's what keeps things so alive and keeps things so special.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other thing about a container like that is that like it takes a lot of resources to hold the container. We can't cosplay it post scarcity all the time because that's not actually the world that we live in.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's a
and I don't think it would
useful
be as fun if we
endeavor.
could.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because, like, there's a few kind of big conversations I've been reading up on, and one of them is this kind of positive sum view of the world as opposed to a kind of competitive zero sum game, right?
Mhm,
So as humans, do we interact thinking that this can be positive sum, that we can all like get what we want, we can all be better
right,
off, or is it competition? you know and like the economist in me frankly is the one that's positive sum, because that's what a good market does. If we come up with a trade, if I say, Josh, you got something I want, you have something I want, I got something you want, and we figure that out. If we engage in the trade, presumably it's because we're both better off, right?
right.
And so we can kind of take that, all of these trades where people can be better off, and if you aggregate it, then actually a lot of people are better off,
Very true,
and
very
we can
true.
increase the capacity, right? So we can build more, we can create more, and like we don't have to live in the confines of zero sum, that by working together we truly can grow the pie.
I guess just to clarify, positive sum means everybody can win, zero sum means in order for me to win, you have to lose, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And obviously there are some contexts in which that's true. Like, I think part of why we're at this moment, you know, is because we didn't build enough housing. And so the housing market got competitive
Mhm,
and it started feeling really zero sum. And so some people wanted to wanted to lessen the competition, which is, I think, makes sense, except that we could just build more housing. It
Right,
doesn't have
right.
to be true, you know? And there's all sorts of reasons we don't, but we should work on them.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, but then there's this other strain, this other conversation that's occurring. And I want to shout out Jerusalem Demos, for positive sum thinking, but there's a lot of thinkers out there, but she's been going at it hard if you ever want to look up her work and the argument, which is an interesting and great platform. But like, there's this other one, which is like, it is true that when humans don't face hardship, we are maybe less good versions of ourselves.
It's like we start to atrophy. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and so how do we, keep sharp? And like nature kept us sharp for a long time. If you weren't sharp, you'd be eaten. Or maybe you wouldn't be able to withstand the storm. But how do we stay sharp while, you know, enjoying the fruits
Mhm.
of a less scarce society, which is good. It is good that fewer people are starving to death. It is good that we have, this abundance of material around us.
Right.
But how do we keep a culture that stays sharp? And some of that has to be, like there's, I think one problem that I run into a lot is that people want, for example, political system to solve all of the problems or an economic system. They think, oh, the economic system needs to solve all of the problem. And I'm like, that's like not the realm of responsibility for an economic system. An economic system cannot give you meaning. That's not its
Hmm.
job. Why
Right,
would we
right,
want our meaning to come from an economic system? Like, that sounds
right.
terrible, you know? And
Very good
so
point.
to create meaning, we need to figure out where meaning lies. And the answer is going to be different for different people. But I think for a lot of people, meaning comes from like making the world a little better, right?
Mhm.
Contributing to human knowledge, contributing to humanity itself by raising good people, solving problems that humanity has. Like, I find meaning in contributing to my communities and thinking a little bit outside of myself. And none of that comes from my economic system, you know.
Right.
And if you want it to, then you might just end up with a really bad economic system that doesn't deliver the goals you think it's going to deliver.
Yeah, I think it's my mind, like, the whole time, I'm just all these paradoxes start just tumbling in my mind because it's like, well, to fix one thing often means, and I know it's not every case, but to, like, improve in one area means to create or to solve one problem, basically solve a problem of humanity oftentimes creates a new one, and so then we
Yeah.
just
But it's a
continue
more
on to this.
refined problem. It's like a more zoned in problem.
Right, right, right.
But we're gonna have to be solving problems for a long time. We've got lots of problems to solve.
But and I think that is the point. I mean, what is the meaning of life? The meaning of life is the journey. The journey is what it's all about the entire time, and we often get caught up in trying to get to the end of the journey only to look back and realize that the whole fun
What's
was
going
getting
on?
there. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I often think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Are you aware of that?
Yeah.
And I think, like, how it's interesting how, for the most part, a lot of society kind of exists on the second or third layer as default, and I think that that creates a lot of confusion and unrest in people because we were meant to struggle, and, we're meant to have to work, we're meant to have to solve problems, we're meant to have to figure things out, and when certain things are just kinda handed to us, we suddenly stop figuring things out and then get confused while we lack purpose and direction and use, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I wish that we could contextualize ourselves in like the greater human struggle. But
How do you
yeah,
mean?
there are some struggles that I think will be enduring, right? I think human freedom is an enduring struggle. right? And I think it matters. And
Mhm.
so I think that we can like dedicate our time and energy to trying to secure more freedom for more people, and that's like a good goal. But there are others, like there's other securities and like, we will be thinking about food security and energy security, and like there are lots of issues to solve to make sure that we can, get to this post scarcity world that I hope humanity gets to eventually. But it won't happen in my lifetime. And chances are we're not going to get there like there will always be ground to make because perfection is impossible. And so we will always be working to get slightly closer.
I think post scarcity is coming sooner than that. You think it's a ways off still?
I mean, I think it's interesting, which I guess I could just keep repeating. I think a lot of things are interesting.
That's why we're here.
I I think that I think we could get closer. Curious how it's going to go. I think that we will. And then yeah, what do I want to say? What I want to say is that we can get in our own way. And
Mhm.
so, I hope that we continue to value science and I hope that we continue to value the incredible breakthroughs that science has brought to us. I hope that we have a regulatory environment that allows new things. So one example that comes to my mind, if we unlock energy abundance, if for example we get like nuclear fusion, then a lot of technologies open up that right now the biggest barrier is energy. So one
Right.
of those technologies, and that's like desalinization, hugely energy intensive, but if you have abundant cheap energy, now we can just desalinize, which helps with water scarcity. I think of lab grown meat, which I personally cannot wait for. The moment we get a nervous system out of my food, the whole thing becomes like easier for me. I eat a lot of meat because I weight lift a lot, and that's
Mhm.
how my body feels healthy. I eat like two full chickens a week, but I wish that those chickens didn't have to suffer for my gains.
Right. 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 Right.
And so lab grown meat can't come soon enough, but you have states like the state of Florida that's already preemptively made that illegal. And so, which is power entrenching, right?
Hmm.
And so, like, how competitive, how flexible will we let, these new things happen? And I think over the course of time, the answer will be yes, but actually, we need to fight for it always. We need to fight against monopoly power, so like we do need government intervention to make sure that markets stay competitive and that competition, that competitiveness in just so many realms of life. And when I say competitive, I don't necessarily mean like, oh, I'm competing against you, but I
But it's a
guess in the area of
motivator to
business.
create. Right. It's a motivator for creating new things, for pushing in better directions and improving and
Yeah, and the real thing is like when we don't have competition in a market. So, for example, if we allow monopoly power, often what happens is stagnation, right?
Mhm.
There's
Right.
less technological change. And so, and it's interesting, how can I use the words pro-social and competitive in the same conversation and think that those are the same things, and that actually deserves some real thought from me, But like, yeah, you want good ideas to be able to rise to the top. And you don't want good ideas smothered because they threaten entrenched power.
Mhm. Which too often seems to be the struggle that we're running into. It seems to be the only reason why I mean, with the current drive of AI, it's really interesting to see how quickly so many improvements and adaptations and just the acceleration is happening because nobody has the power. Nobody has the monopoly control over it.
Yeah, it's
So
competitor.
that's incentivizing the entire world to race to improve and adapt and release, improved model after improved model and whether or not it's all in our best interest, that's another argument. But either way, it's really interesting to see something improve so rapidly and change so rapidly, and it's because there's not one person controlling the say so, and so everybody's racing to, yeah, try to be there first, I guess.
Yeah, no, and it's like, remarkable. And like it'll be interesting to see where it goes and like everything. Some of it will be good, some of it will be bad.
Right, right.
And hopefully, because like the other thing is that, like, we truly do need some regulation is good, right? There's all sorts of market failures that can happen, So one of the, kind of first ones we teach is like a negative externality, right? So if I produce some good and it pollutes, the air to do so, I'm not capturing that cost to society in my cost of production. And so the price does not reflect all of the costs of the good because
Mhm.
negative externality exists, right?
Mm.
And so
Okay.
I think, yeah, so I think that like we have this individualistic strain, which sometimes is really good. I believe in individual rights, and I think that all individuals should be free, you know? But then we also are this deeply social species that does need that community level, you know? And with AI, it'll be interesting to see if our institutions, just have the capacity to like understand what's happening. It's not clear to me Congress like understands AI, you know?
I mean, I was listening to at the Global Economic Forum, and the way tech guys were having to speak to the rooms was very, very, very low grade. I'm using very simple terms.
Well, it's hard when we have this, like, as more human knowledge exists, you can really specialize. And I know when I
Mhm.
taught, like, I don't know anything about that. I wish I knew more about physics. I wish this on a regular basis. I guess not enough to actually put in the time, but I'm getting there. I'm getting there. But like, yeah, you can really specialize. You can really span out in a small part of human knowledge. And it's important to be able to communicate with people who are less specialized, so we
Right,
can
right,
like,
right, right. That is
yeah,
important,
yeah.
but it is scary when to me, I don't know if it's so much about the ability to communicate as it is that I think a lot of the people in power are entrenched, so deeply entrenched that they've had no need to adapt their own thinking to a lot of the progression that's been happening, with technology behind the scenes up until now. Now we're reaching this forefront of like, "Hey, gotta figure it out now," because there's no more putting things off till later, I guess.
Yeah, and there's like big questions that, you know, impact a lot of us, And to be clear, I don't think that the answer is like end AI research. I think that's
Mhm.
not, like a reasonable thing. Also doesn't get maximum benefit with minimal cost. And that's what we should be trying for, And I think
Maximum benefit, minimum cost, right?
yeah, yeah. And I think one thing that has happened in the US is that our legislature has become so ineffective
Mhm.
that we feel like we can't pass laws. And when we do have laws, we feel like we can't improve them. And so then we're stuck under this imperfect law. And I think about this, for example, with some environmental regulation. So, like a really classic case of this is NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act, which was, made in an era where there wasn't enough community feedback on the things that were happening, and so they created a process to really, have a lot of moments of review, lots of studies. But then fast forward 50 years, and now we're using environmental legislation to stop the construction of solar energy.
Right,
Or
right,
we're
right.
using NEPA. It held up congestion pricing for New York City for like 5 or 6 years,
Mhm.
And so, like, is this good for the environment? Is this good for people? And the answer is like, no, like it clearly needs to be tuned. There were
Right.
some good things, but we need to change some things. But I think that we have a system that has gotten calcified and does not allow us to regularly and routinely update our laws so that they fit our current problems and our current environments, you know? And so then we get kind of stuck. And so, it's hard. And I hope that we can figure out how to have a government that actually does things and how we incentivize that for politicians.
Yeah, something about being human, being messy and imperfect in pretty much every aspect. Because it's like we found something that worked for so long, and then now we're seeing, it's outdated and needs to be updated, but it's been holding back positive improvements and positive impacts. And then you see people coming around like Elon with Doge to just upend everything. And it's like, well, on the one hand, I get what you're trying to do, but is this the right way to do it? And, you know,
Yeah.
it's impossible to do it the right way, but then nobody wants to
It's
agree
not
on
impossible. It takes will, and it takes
better said.
convincing. We have to
Mhm.
convince people, and it needs to be evidence-based. And the other thing is that like two humans may not ever agree on like what the right level of trade-offs between, for example, the economy and the environment might be. And another thing that I think about a lot is just the genetic diversity that exists within the human species. So for any trait you can imagine, there's probably some normal distribution, you know,
Mhm.
of that trait in our species.
Right.
And so some people are more risk averse. Some people are less risk averse. Some people are more oriented towards communal good. Some people are a little bit more just inherently selfish, and that may not be bad. And there may be circumstances in which that like saves the human species. And so the reason we have this genetic diversity within our species is so that the species can survive a lot of different circumstances, a lot
Mhm.
of different shocks. So that's how we can be robust to change. And it's interesting, like in betting markets or where we aggregate the knowledge and signals of humans, like betting markets get things on average like pretty right, more so than any individual could because it's this sum accumulation of a bunch of different humans who are bringing different priors, different information, and then also, different values to things. And so, like democracy is always going to be messy because we're always going to have to be in a constant state of trying to convince each other what is good, you
I
know.
like that positive spin on degenerate activities.
Okay.
Yeah, but no, that was well said, though. Absolutely, you bring together all these people doing something from purely materialistic reasons, but now we're getting actually information and probably able to predict real world events maybe better through it. That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and in economics, that's what we think of for like prices. Prices
Mhm.
are, the result of many, many transactions. And that kind of tells us like how much do we value this resource or this good,
Right, right.
you know? How scarce is it? There's a lot of information that's captured and how much does it cost to produce? There's lots of information that's captured in a price, and prices are set by this aggregation
Mhm.
over, many different transactions.
So if you were to then, I guess, kind of to tie this back to the beginning, I think what I'm hearing overall and what I agree with is that if we can find a some sort of standard set of values to align with, then we can all be our different selves within this structure and have a better society overall. Almost like if we can find a 10 commandments that we loosely agree with, then we can have our own variations around that. I mean, I think that the generalized statement is treat everybody else as a human, like be kind to one another. I think it's if we're all kind to one another, then everything else should play out. But then, like you said, there's so many genetic differences. Some people are what it means, what is kind to one person may not be kind to somebody else. But if we're under the collective agreement of treat people well with respect, it's like where do you think that is there a generalized set of guidelines that you think everybody could agree with that would benefit society?
So, you know, no, not everyone is ever always like, there's no world in which we can get everyone to agree, you
Right.
know. And so it's really like, how do we adjudicate disagreements, you know, and like, what what are the rules that by which we can say like this is like the minimum threshold, and so I'm like very much like an old school liberal. And by that I mean like individual rights protection,
Mhm.
freedom of speech, freedom of congregation, like enlightenment thinking, which is currently being challenged on both sides. There are
Mhm.
anti-liberals on both sides, but I believe in liberalism. I still do. And I think um, that it is the best way to coexist and to adjudicate differences while protecting individual rights. And then, like democracy is that aggregating of individuals and what they want and like what direction they want the country to go in. And so having a very clear link to democratic will, I think is really necessary. Um, and if I had to point at one of the foundational dysfunctions of our government, and I know I said I wanted to not do too much politics, and I keep leading us there, but like a bigger way, I think one of the things is the degree to which we have gerrymandering and the degree to which most elections are not competitive. And what that
Well,
does
because
is
you say
like,
that you say the word democracy, and I think that's, like, lost a lot of its meaning, but essentially you mean everybody has a say, right?
yes, yes. And that government is sensitive to that democratic will. But for that to be the case, we need competitive elections, which just means that the politicians have to actually promise change, have to actually want to change things,
Mhm.
right? I think with uncompetitive elections, and most in this country aren't, then you have one party rule of, functionally, and that leads to complacency, you know?
Well, and I'm certainly hopeful, but to play against devil's advocate in there, I think that our government essentially formed from all these things that from a need of all these things we're talking about. We start with a village, and everybody in the village is only 10 people, so it's easy for all 10 people to get a say. But now we expanded to the point there's 100 people. Well, it's a little harder to get 100 people. We can still do it. Now we have 1,000 people. Okay, now it's really hard to get every 1,000 people's voices heard. So let's instead elect 100 of the 1,000 to now be the voice. So it made like there's a reason why we
See how
have
it
elected
happens.
officials to speak for us, but then back to the sense of the idea of power. I mean, I think this is like a primal urge to have power. I think power is the people say money, but all money is power. So really, whatever human drives for is to have power, have control and authority over their own life. So I almost see it as I don't like to say it's not that I'm pessimistic about reality, but also I think I see a lot of things as being inevitable. Like I don't see how do you have this many people without having a government that has to speak for its people, which is inevitably going to lead to people being misrepresented.
Oh, that's right. And no government's going to be perfect, right?
Right.
But we still need to try.
Yes, 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 yes. Agreed. Agreed. So it's agreeing that we're never going to do it right, but we're going to keep trying. Yeah.
No, and through that iteration, you can get closer,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so, like,
Don't strive for perfection, just strive for greatness.
yeah, like, and because even if you achieve perfection for a certain moment in time, like, conditions change.
Right.
The answer that is perfect for one moment in time
Mm.
will not be perfect later.
Like the
You know,
environmental act you mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, we live in a dynamic world. And the same thing with me understanding who I am and how that's also dynamic.
Mhm.
Because like, you know, everything's always changing and I got to figure out where I am in relationship to that. It's a moving target. It's a maximization problem, where it's
Mm.
always changing, so you always got to be maximizing, but like, yeah, I think that liberalism lays some pretty good ground rules for how we can coexist. how we can bring people who value different things together and and live together in the same society. And then what do we organize around and what binds us together? Probably freedom, valuing
Mm.
freedom. It's probably
Yeah.
freedom and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
prosperity.
Right,
Why do people come to America? It is for freedom and prosperity. What are
right.
we proud of? I'm proud of America's freedom and prosperity, and also I think those two are linked. I think that we are prosperous because we are free. You know, I think it's important that someone can start a new business. Economic freedom is part of this, like freedom is real freedom. But also real that deep human freedom, does require access to community. Yeah. And so it'll be curious to see how it goes. And maybe I'll get to see a little bit more of the story over my lifetime. Because another funny thing about being human is that, we're part of this story of humanity, right? And it's much longer than we have documentation of. They think that modern humans existed for 300,000 years. We
Right,
have
right.
12,000 years of maybe only 6,000 years of written history. But we've only seen a small bit of it. But we have deeper traditions that certainly have been passed down for longer, you know. But we are part of this human story, but we're only a snapshot.
Mm.
We only see a snapshot of the story. But while that's occurring, it's we're all of the humans alive right now.
Right, right. And I think it's
It's
really important to keep
everything.
zooming out. It's definitely really
Yeah,
important to keep zooming out.
yeah, yeah. And so I hope, when you think about what it means for humans to be more interconnected, globally, we can find our communities to such precise levels. Whereas if I had grown up in a small town and not been able to move, and if it was before the internet, maybe I would have never found people who appreciated my orange hair, or who thought like me. But as we get more interconnected, I think that we can find our communities much easier,
Mhm.
our self-chosen communities. But also there's huge value in broad communities and sharing space with people who aren't exactly like us. And then hopefully we can figure out how how to not just coexist, but how to work together, you
How to
know,
co-create.
how to
Yeah,
co-create.
yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think that's beautifully well said, and I definitely agree that I think freedom is a good baseline for aligning, aligning values. If we all work towards freedom, that's a good thing. And I think, I mean, you brought up multiple times. It's important to remember because I living in America, it's easy to take things for granted and to, I mean, only see the echo chamber that we live in and think, oh, this is just how it should be, and get angry about the imperfections within that. When really, I mean, like you said, this is, I mean, probably the freest people have ever been in America in all time because one, we're not fighting for survival every day. We have such an abundance of resources, an abundance of opportunities, and while it varies from person to person's experience, absolutely, it's important to remember. I think how far we come, and I guess I mean when you really frame it like that, it's a beautiful time to be here now. In a time of the most freedom to expand. I think that humans have ever really had. Um, because all we have is time.
Yeah, but also we have to never forget that it can backslide,
Mm,
and we have to work to make sure because it's not even sufficient to just protect what we have. I think that
mhm,
it's morally imperative to expand that freedom, to expand it to other people.
right, and how do you do that?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, you do that through politics, you do that through
Mm,
legislation, you do that through the normal grind of the process. And I've seen freedom greatly expanded over my lifetime. When I was young, gay people couldn't get married.
right,
And
right.
that's a real freedom that we've fought for,
I think
and
self-expression then maybe, right?
yeah, yeah. And the freedom to be weird, the
Mhm,
freedom to be weird and have that be okay, and maybe even a little celebrate.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sarge. Really appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on and talking with me about what it means to be human. Is there any other final thoughts you'd like to share?
No, just that I thought I would enjoy our conversation, and I did. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm glad. It was good talking with you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.